Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, my name is Bruce Scott, Director of Partnership and Communication at the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel, as well as all of you to this media event, which will take place over the next hour and a half. This event is being organized by the Consortium of the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, CGIAR, and we're honored here at ILRI to be hosting this particular event. ILRI is one of the 15 international agriculture research centers we deal specifically with livestock, and here in Nairobi we have our global headquarters and offices and operations focused in South Asia as well as throughout sub-Saharan Africa. At this point I'd like to ask Jeff Haskins to take the microphone and introduce the distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. This morning we're here for the food crisis in the Horn of Africa, a media briefing on the challenges and opportunities for mitigating drought-induced food crises. The panel today will discuss some of the long-term evidence-based solutions and interventions that are needed to avert the profound effect of a predicted extreme weather events in the future. We're joined by Mark Gordon, who is the co-chair of the UN Somalia Food Cluster with the World Food Program, Dr. David Mwangi, Assistant Director for Animal Production at CARI, Dr. Namanga Ngongi, President for AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, Jeff Hill, the Director of Policy for the Bureau of Food Aid, USAID, and Lloyd LePage, the CEO of the CGIAR Consortium. We're going to start with Mark. Each of the speakers will give brief remarks, and then we'll follow by a Q&A with the media. Thanks.
Good morning. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be able to be here today and be able to speak with you briefly about these new initiatives and exciting challenges with the current crisis in the Horn. As everyone is already likely aware, that over 12 million men, women, and children are affected by the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the Horn of Africa. This crisis crosses political boundaries and is currently affecting the countries in the Horn of Africa of Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and eastern Uganda. The current crisis has been prefaced with the statement that in the Horn of Africa, this is the worst drought in the past 60 years and has led to the failure of crops, death of livestock, and the lack of availability of water, leading to hundreds of thousands of children becoming malnourished, households selling their savings and productive assets, and in the most severely affected areas, family packing up, leaving their social network, and migrating across international borders into Kenya, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. Currently, there is a broad humanitarian response being undertaken by national governments, the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, and members of civil society. Responses include immediate life-saving support to households facing famine, including the direct provision of food and, where possible, the means to purchase it on the market, coupled with nutritional rehabilitation to children under 5 who are severely malnourished and at the risk of death, and the provision of water, shelter, and health care to those who are most affected. Aside from the immediate life-saving actions, governments and the humanitarian community are also investing in responses that will allow those that have stripped their assets to meet their food needs through livelihoods, will be provided with livelihood support, provision of livelihood inputs, and protection vaccination programs to ensure that the surviving assets, mainly livestock and the seeds they have for planting, will be available when the next rains come. To understand how we arrived at the current crisis and where are potentially the areas for mid and longer term solutions, it's important to understand the main drivers of the crisis in the Horn And although I'm not going to be exhaustive, mainly due to time, I'd like to share just a brief synopsis of a piece of analysis done by the World Food Programme's Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping Division. One of the first drivers, obviously, is rainfall. As I've previously mentioned, the current crisis has been identified as the worst drought in the past 60 years. And indeed, rainfall over the past 2 seasons have been well below normal, meaning that rainfall-dependent agriculturalists and pastoralists that rely on rainfall to recharge water points and pasture for their livestock were faced with crop failures and the death of their livestock, which has a significant impact on the way by which these households meet their food needs through their own production. A second key driver is prices. At the same time, we saw the return of exceptionally high food prices in local, regional, and global markets for basic cereals such as maize, rice, and wheat, caused locally partially by poor production in the region over 2 seasons, but also globally there was a tightening of supply due to events halfway around the world, such as the drought in China, heat waves in Russia, and a flood in Pakistan, as well as increasing costs of inputs to produce and transport the food, with the price of oil returning to over $100 a barrel. This impacted on the ability of not only poor households to meet their food needs through the market, but pastoral and agricultural households that lost livestock and crops due to the poor rainfall, which was also their principal means to be able to purchase food on the market, were now having to face even higher prices. The third key driver is conflict. Coupled with the poor rains and global prices, local, and regional prices being well above normal, conflict, both political and resource-driven or resource scarcity-driven, has impacted the ability of households to move to areas of traditional refuge during poor rains, and also it restricted the ability of traders to move food into rural markets. As I have mentioned, this list is not exhaustive, but it does highlight some of the fundamental drivers of the current crisis in the Horn. However, we, as members of a global community, need to also bear in mind that this is not the first crisis in the Horn in the past 10 years. Poor rainfall, high food, fuel, and agricultural prices, and conflict led to tens of millions of men, women, and children in 2008, 2009, and again in 2006, and again in 2001. So the question I struggle with, and many others, is how can we reduce vulnerable households and livelihoods that are at risk due to frequently recurring and greater duration of shocks than from what's known from historical memory? Part of the answer, I believe, here in the Horn of Africa, which WFP, other UN agencies, NGOs, and governments are looking to engage in livelihood recovery and livelihood strengthening activities. These resilience activities, through a disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management lens, which incorporate a seasonal perspective that allows for an adaptation of a changing environment, provides vulnerable households with strategies that can reinforce their current livelihoods and allowing them to mitigate or reduce the impact of stresses and shocks. For example, in dryland agricultural systems, agrarian, pastoral, and agro-pastoral systems that we see here in the Horn have been faced across entire districts, and communities have been threatened by advancing and repeated shocks. This leading to desertification, crusting of soils, crop failures, wind erosion, overgrazing, tree cover loss, below normal water tables or loss of the water table. Sorry, I changed the page. Loss of the water table, as well as deterioration of the ability of the land to absorb water when rain does hit, such as flash floods. In these environments, the range and type of emergency recovery and resilience building interventions chosen to address the food security problem need to be linked together as an overarching strategy, and encompasses not only the social political but also the needs of the communities and addressing their priorities. For WFP, depending upon the time frame of the response, WFP would look at livelihood protection, which is immediate response, ensuring that households that have been affected by a shock are not required to strip their assets. Another type of focus would be asset restoration, looking at the assets that the community have that are perhaps somewhat deteriorated by the shock, which allows them longer-term resilience, looking at asset restoration, and then finally looking at developing new community-based assets that develop and strengthen the community's livelihoods resilience. Tangible examples of this include the Sustainable Land Management Program in Ethiopia, which is done by the World Food Program partners and the government of Ethiopia, and also in Kenya and Djibouti, the constructions of soil bunds designed to trap rainwater, and also the construction of underground reservoirs for human consumption and community gardens. The fact that the current crisis is not a one-off event should be a wake-up call for all of us. Currently, several mid to longer term strategies are being developed, for example, the Plan of Action for the Horn of Africa, and these can provide a framework for strategic thinking on gaps which agricultural research centers, such as ILRI and others, could meet. And partnership between these agencies that develops proven, tested, and appropriate technology that can be used at the community level with governments, humanitarian and development agencies on the ground could be a further step in the right direction to reduce the vulnerability of households in marginal areas or threatened livelihoods to be just a little bit more resilient the next time the next shock happens. I am pleased to be able to here to speak with you today. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion to help further contribute to solutions that will address the massive and daunting challenges we have in the Horn. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists. My name is David Miano Mwangi, working for the Kenya Agriculture Research Institute. Kenya Agriculture Research Institute is mandated to carry out research in the nation for food crops and livestock, apart from maybe 3 crops, that's sugarcane, coffee, and tea. So all the other food crops and other industrial crops and livestock fall within the mandate of CGIAR. CGIAR has research centers all over the nation covering the different agroecologies. And one of the major areas where we have had quite a lot of work done over the years is the arid and semi-arid areas of Kenya. And these are the areas mainly impacted very negatively by the current crisis. And some of the activities we have carried on, I'll be detailing some of them. It will be very, very difficult to carry out, to detail all the issues that CGIAR is carrying on in the next 5 minutes, but I'll try to highlight some of the issues and some of the key areas where we feel as an institution would help avert a crisis like the one we are having, and what we feel should be the issues that we are addressing. As I've said, we have crop research. We also have natural resource management research, because we feel these are some of the areas where the advances we have made are really useful in addressing some of the issues that we have. In terms of livestock, we address both production and health in the region, and I'll be highlighting some of the areas that we are really working on. In terms of crop production and crop research, we've been looking at working and looking for appropriate crops that would fit in the agroecology that we have. Those of you who are aware, in Kenya, basically we define hunger as the lack of maize. Now, when you look at some of the areas that are impacted very negatively with this crisis, once in 5 years, if you are growing a crop of maize with the kind of rainfall we have, with the kind of production systems we have, maybe in 5 years, your harvest is once in 5 years. That always then leads into a crisis, because you are always deficient, you are always in a crisis. And one of the things we have been looking at is what are those crops that would actually do much better than maize in this area. And we have quite a number of crops that we've been dealing with. We've been dealing with sorghums and millets, which are more suitable in these areas. During this drought, the current drought that we are facing now, the rains failed in a lot of these areas, but farmers who are growing some sorghum, farmers who are growing some millet, still had a small harvest compared to maize, where everything failed. But we've been asking ourselves, we have had these varieties for a long time, but they don't seem to be moving. And we've been asking ourselves, what is the issue? And we've been looking at several things. One is dietary habits have changed. So you talk to people in Ukambani and tell them you can grow sorghum, and then the next question is, what do I then do with the sorghum? And when you look at the markets, 2-3 years ago, they were only paying 5 shillings per kilo of millet or sorghum. And therefore, that does not translate into an income that then the families can use to buy food. So a lot of them are then in this vicious cycle of trying to grow maize and to produce maize in an area where this does not happen. So what we have done is tried to look at our research results and link with partners that would help commercialize some of those products, so that then families then have an income through which then they can purchase food. Now, in the last 3 years, we have worked with sorghums, mainly for East African breweries. That is a major brewing company in the region, looking at how can we replace some of their brewing products so that they can buy then sorghum from the small-scale producers in the ASAL areas. And through the research work that CGIAR has been done, we have a variety that is suitable for brewing. And what we've done is then linked with these African breweries to provide a certain market for the farmers. Now, that changed quite a lot of things. The price for sorghum changed from 5 shillings to 17 shillings a kilo. That's a threefold increase in the price that the farmers could get. Now, we have also looked at other events where we are looking at what we are calling village-based processing units, where then they can transform some of the food crops that we are talking about, like cassava, into products that then can be stored by the families. One of the major problems with some of these crops, like cassava, is that they are so perishable that a family can produce a lot of it in a season like the one we have. But for how long do they have it as food? And that transformation into some processing activities in the villages is one of the things that we are working on in an effort to transform our research results into some commercial products. Now, in terms of livestock research, we've been working on several species of animals, and we've been thinking one of the major problems that we've been having, and one of the reasons why we have the crisis we have right now, is when we don't have the appropriate type of livestock in the different areas. Now, I was out in the field in Laisamis, somewhere in northern Kenya, last week. And one of the major things that hit me very hard and kind of told me we are working on the right type of animals is, if you go to the north right now, the only animal that is lactating is a camel. But when you look at our research in the past, that has been an animal that we have not really worked on. We've worked on cattle, we've worked on goats, we've worked on sheep, but we've just realized that one of the things we really need to put a lot of efforts on is the camel. If you go into a herd right now and you have 20% of the camels calving down at this time, it means then that family has some product that they can use. And we've been working on how do we then work with the camel keepers, and how do we help them with post-harvest handling of the product, because that's another major area. And we've been working quite a lot with ILRI to look at how then do we help the pastoralists to handle the products that they get, so that then they have something to consume during crisis like we have now, and also try and integrate them into the formal economic system. And one of the major things that this work has come up with, there's a lot of consumption of camel and camel products in the urban centers, but the movement of those products from the ASAL areas into these urban centers has been a major problem. A good example is camel milk. And we've realized that by the time camel milk comes from Isiolo or Bangale in Garissa and gets to Nairobi, 70% of that milk gets to Nairobi as spoiled milk. So then whoever is marketing that has lost already, even before they start 70% of the product. And we've been looking at ways of assisting them to handle the product in a better way so that then more of the products can get into the market. Now, natural resource management is a big issue, especially in the ASAL areas. We have very scarce water resources. The soils are very, very fragile. And if you look at a lot of the activities we've had, and we're still talking about right now, is irrigation. How can we improve our irrigation system so that these communities then can have some crop, even when you have a dry season like we have had. And we've really realized several things. One is that these areas will have irrigation water, yes, but it's very marginal irrigation water. So developing appropriate irrigation methods that then do not result in salinity of the soils, because if you look at a lot of the irrigation, even the irrigation systems that have been started, the first 2 years you have very good crop yields. By the third year you have a collapse of the yields. One of the major problems being soil salinity in some of these areas. So we are also working on natural resource management, including water and irrigation systems. And just recently we launched a small irrigation scheme that we are calling a model scheme on the edge of the Chalbi Desert, for those who have a bit of grasp of the Kenyan geography. This system, a lot of money has been pumped into it over the years, but although we know the resource, the water resource that is there can irrigate at least 100 hectares, the water has only been used for about 20 hectares because of the system that was being used, the efficiency of water utilization. Now we have opened 100 hectares of irrigation that is assisting about 100 families in that zone. But the major thing here and the major lesson basically is we need to match the investments in terms of infrastructure with knowledge. And that has been a bit of lacking. Matching these two so that as you invest the resources, then you are also using the right technologies. We've also been working on rangelands and livestock production in those areas. A lot of the times, the issue that has come up is that we are grossly overstocked in those areas. Now, after our work in some of those areas, we believe we are not really overstocked, but we are not really managing the resource, the natural resource well enough to produce enough biomass for the livestock that we have. And therefore, we've been working on reseeding some of the rangelands. If you realize one of the major things with the rangelands we have now, they are very degraded. And therefore, even when you have rainfall, two things happen. Because of the crusting of the soil, a lot of the water just runs over the surface of the land. Secondly, we have exhausted the seed bank in those soils, so that even when you have rainfall, you don't really have a regeneration of the pastures that then would feed into the livestock. And that's something we've been working on, looking at the appropriate grass seeds to produce. And since one of the major problems we have had is that a lot of the commercial companies have not really been interested in those types of seeds because they are seen to be low value, so economic profit is not there. We've been working with what we are calling community-based seed systems, where we build the capacity of the farmers then to produce good seeds that can then be used for reseeding. And I'm glad to mention that in the last maybe 1 year, we have had maybe more than 100 tons of seed going into Somalia, going into Sudan and other areas from some of these community-based systems, and also reseeding parts of northern Kenya. So as far as we are concerned, there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of information that can be used to improve some of the systems that we have. But we need to start linking more closely with development. We need to start linking more closely with private sector. And some of our success stories that we can share even after this are based on those areas where we have linked with private sector, where then a profit can be made by everybody in that chain, and therefore sustaining that system. And we would want to work on a lot of these issues to see that in future we can commercialize a lot of the research results that come out of CGIAR, that come out of ILRI, to help and assist these communities living in these areas. So as far as I'm concerned, one of the missing links basically is the link between the results from research and development. And right now, everybody, all agencies will be going out there to assist rebuild the assets. One of the things they'll go out there with is seed. But what type of seed are they going out there with? The UN agencies, the ministries of agriculture and livestock in this country will be going out there with seed. But what type of seed? I would say we have the solution, we have the seeds that will then fit in some of these areas. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Hill from the U.S. Agency for International Development. And while I'm here in an official capacity from the United States Agency for International Development, I have the distinct privilege to also be working closely with the CADP Development Partners Group, which includes a substantial number of development agencies supporting agriculture and rural development in Africa. And it's really from this vantage point that I want to express appreciation of the development community for the steps that are being taken here over the next several days to focus dialogue on the opportunities and challenges to the long-term development of the arid and semi-arid lands. In 2008, the severe impact of rapidly rising food and fuel prices was a wake-up call to the global community about the vulnerability that has been caused by the decades of underinvestment in agriculture and sustainable food security. The result was a collective call to action and a global commitment to more than $22 billion to the L'Aquila Food Security Initiative, including $3.5 billion and the Feed the Future initiative from the United States. Nearly 2 years into the L'Aquila 3-year commitment, we're here experiencing another wake-up call. One that reminds us that the issue isn't simply underinvestment in a sector, but also underinvestment in specific regions and agroecosystems. While drought and conflict are certainly driving the famine in Somalia, drought alone does not explain the extreme levels of food insecurity seen elsewhere in the Horn's arid and semi-arid lands of the ASALs. It is not drought but vulnerability to drought that is eroding food security in these areas, and this vulnerability is a result of chronic underinvestment. This is particularly true for the livestock-based systems, which are and will be dominant part of these systems. From a long-term development perspective, the relatively low population density of arid and semi-arid lands, combined with real and exaggerated perceptions of environmental, economic, and political risk, have meant that they have not received the development assistance needed to tap their potential contribution to sustained national economic transformation and development. That said, the arid and semi-arid lands play a critical role, both positive and negative, in the Kenyan and Ethiopian economies. From a positive perspective, with little support, their livestock-based economies drive a value chain which constitutes 35 to 40% of agricultural GDP in Ethiopia and 45 to 50% of the agricultural GDP in Kenya. In Somalia, livestock systems fuel the economy. From a negative perspective, the ASAL's vulnerability to the impacts of drought results in an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars of humanitarian assistance on a predictable basis. The potential and challenges of the ASALs are not unrecognized, and this is reflected in the national plans like Kenya's Vision 2030 and Ethiopia's Growth and Transformation Program. These plans and their translation into national agriculture and food security investment plans do give significant attention to the arid and semi-arid lands development for some of the first times. Reflecting the continent-wide vision of African leaders articulated through the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan, CADP, These plans are currently country-owned and country-led. They offer the framework and umbrella to coordinate assistance and to build a coalition of support to sustainably address and tackle the challenges faced in the ACELs. However, the long-term development of the ACELs cannot be achieved by government or one development program alone. They will require the joint efforts by many parties, including government, private sector, and civil society. Working together with a common development framework, we need to jointly rally round and support these national plans. This work will mean addressing significant challenges that cut across all sectors. And without commitment to and investment in a comprehensive, long-term vision, the gains made towards food security today will be undermined by the impacts of environmental degradation, high fertility, and low literacy rates tomorrow. At the heart of the long-term development of the arid and semi-arid lands will be research, science, and technology, just as they have been throughout the world. In the near term, we need to better harness the knowledge and technology that do exist and improve access to and use of these innovations. Concurrently, a sustained commitment is needed to the long-term science and research agenda to help forecast and solve the constraints and barriers to increase productivity and income generation in the ACELs. As I conclude, I would like to recognize the important efforts that the CGIAR in creating a new relationship with Africa. The CGIAR reforms recently launched and recent progress of the CAADP create a new opportunity to both deepen and focus a relationship aimed at helping African countries achieve their goals and aspirations for a more prosperous agricultural economy. This new relationship, now taking shape, will include stronger linkages between the CGIAR and the African Union Commission, aimed at improving accountability, and a renewed effort to work with African institutions to jointly shape a new agricultural science agenda for Africa, built around the key agroecosystems for African agriculture, such as the arid and semi-arid lands. There has never been a more appropriate time or a more urgent time or a more urgent need to harness and focus the will and capacity of the research community. The United States applauds and supports these efforts. Thank you, and asante sana.
Good morning, fellow panelists, distinguished guests, members of the press. It's really a great opportunity to be here together with fellow panelists to exchange views on the current situation in the Horn of Africa and what could be done in the medium to long term to ensure that such problems in the future will have less gravity on the human population. I would not dwell on the causes. Those have been adequately covered. I think that all of us know why we are here and why we have this situation now in the Horn of Africa. But to at least try to see what can be done in the future. But before I go into the future, I would like to say we should acknowledge what has been done before. My early work in the United Nations, first job was in the World Food Program as head of East and Southern Africa, 1984, December. January of 85, I was in Ethiopia. And anybody who is old enough to have remembered what happened in those days would see that it was a terrible catastrophe in which about 1 million people died. The fact that the region has doubled in population, more than doubled in population since then, and that with the worst drought in 60 years, they're having about the same number of people who are impacted upon, shows that there has been some progress. But 12 million or 13 million people, that's too many to be exposed to such hardship. And a lot of lives, especially of young children, have been lost. Could have been prevented if some measures were taken. In the face of such human catastrophe, clearly the humanitarian response has to be the first, and should be based on well-designed, medium to long-term safety nets that are triggered by recognized early warning systems that have been put in place. All of these have been discussed for decades. The question is how to put them in place. And I do hope that as a result of this current experience, the countries in the region will be able now to put in place measures that will ensure safety nets, that will build on information coming out of the early warning systems that are there already and which can be strengthened. What we do know from base of science, here the CG system, our colleagues are here, a lot of research has been carried out, including what our colleague from CARI said. What is needed is to scale up the use of this knowledge, of taking research, putting it into use, having research become an area for investment, at least use of the results of research to be invested. We can talk until kingdom come about seeds. If they are not produced by somebody who is able to produce them and sell them at a profit, they will not be produced. So we have to find systems that address such issues in the long term. That is the way in which AGRA was set up to work. The Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa is working to scale up known knowledge that has been tested and that works in terms of producing seed, especially in the case now of the Horn of Africa, of drought-tolerant crops and varieties. You go to Machakos, not too far from here, or Moranga, everybody can see the crops that are growing. The maize is dead. Cassava is growing, sorghum is growing, pigeon peas growing. It means that we have to adapt our agriculture to also the changing nature of our environment. If that can be done, it will really save a lot of suffering of a lot of people around. Resistant as we are to changing food habits, unfortunately, we have to adjust our food habits, not to abandon maize. Maize can be grown in the areas where it is well adapted, but to move to those crops which are much more adapted to a larger part of the Horn of Africa than maize. So somehow that has to be done. And I hope that we'll be able to do that. A big question is market structures. Market structures that are not adapted to a lot of the crops that are really drought tolerant. Our colleague from CARI already said also some of those crops. How to process and store cassava. How to add value to sorghum and millet. How to ensure that pigeon peas are really, first of all, become part of the diet of the population. A lot of pigeon peas produced in the region, especially from Tanzania and the rest, is exported to India. But that's a crop that is drought tolerant and that can produce a lot of nutritious food for the population. How to integrate that into our diets. And the crop more grown in West Africa than East Africa, cowpeas. There are now cowpea varieties, drought tolerant, that produce food in 50 to 60 days from planting. It is how to scale up these experiences that are being obtained throughout Africa. And to be able to have processing facilities that encourage enrichment of the food so that it can be more acceptable and easier to cook, especially for the growing urban population, and have those linkages. We in the AGRA, we are working also closely with World Food Program on the Purchase for Progress, which I think is a wonderful program that has been put in place to create structured markets that smallholder farmers can access through warehouse receipt systems. That, I think, is a progress that can be scaled up in the future. Food crops cannot be traded, let me say, or you just go to the roadside and buy. There's no estimation of what is likely to be available next year. We have heard of other commodities. They have commodity exchanges. Why are food crops not be able to have commodity exchanges for food crops? So you can have tradable stocks that are held in commercial warehouses for trade. Of course, trade in food is always politically sensitive, but people have to eat. And to it, they have to be sure that commodities are available in the future. Governments can put in place measures, regulations that reduce speculation on food commodities. But commodity exchanges are really essential, that it should be put in place. The questions of risks to livestock and crops has been touched on by several colleagues. But we can insure our cars, but cannot insure our food. Why? We can insure our houses, but there's no insurance, at least it's only starting now, no real insurance for Africa's crops. It's about time that those were also addressed. Not only crops, livestock. The livestock farmer, the pastoralist who loses 80–90% of the stock, how will they restock? How will they rebuild their livelihoods? Just from humanitarian assistance? There has to be a structured way of approaching such problems. My colleague Jeff Hill has mentioned NEPA, CADAPIER, so I think I'll just say that that was a wonderful framework. It's still a wonderful framework. It challenged all the governments to use 10% of their national budgets for agriculture. We know how difficult it is for governments to respect their own engagements to contribute 10% of their own budgets to agriculture. The donors have been very generous. I do not wish to say what percentage of the L'Aquila agreement has been respected, probably 20–25%. Governments in Africa, particularly in the Horn, cannot continue to rely just on donor commitments. They have to increasingly rely on their own resources and put resources on the table to be able to address the agricultural programs which will address such drought situations in the future. Just relying on external assistance will not help. They should put on the table. And I'm glad to see that at least here in Kenya, the government has declared that it wants to put a lot more money on the table. I think the government now is about 7 or 8% of the budget to agriculture. I would encourage them to get to the 10% the next budget. But we should also find ways of involving the private sector to engage in investing in agriculture. And we in AGRA, we are trying to test a system of using public resources to generate or leverage resources from the private sector. That is being done now in Nigeria at large scale. $500 million from the central bank to leverage about $3 billion from the commercial banks. Here in Kenya, the government has been engaged itself to use $65 million to leverage $650 million from the private banks. AGRA's small experience with Equity Bank really has been a growing success, using $5 million from AGRA and IFAD to leverage $50 million from Equity Bank. We should find creative ways of increasing investment to agriculture. I would say that we cannot continue to talk about drought if we cannot address water management. Drought is lack of water, the absence of rain. That is drought. The only way to counteract the absence of rain is to have water that has been stored to replace rain that would have fallen. And that is called building reservoirs, having irrigation systems, having maybe check dams within little check bonds within farms to store water. We cannot fight a drought by talking or by paper or by anything else except water. And there is water in Africa. There's water in the Horn of Africa. There is water that can be used to guarantee some kind of production. Let me just end by saying that with all that we saw, what has not been mentioned is the critical role of farmers' organizations and civil society. Here in Kenya, civil society has been really mobilized around the Kenyan Red Cross to be able to bring about humanitarian relief. I'm sure they can also be mobilized to bring about support to medium to longer term actions that will prevent or reduce the gravity of such situations in the future. And farmers' organizations, above all, will be capable of being able to support their members so that they build around themselves some much more durable livelihood strategies. AGRA, as an institution, will work with the rest of the partners here present, with the government of Kenya, the CG system, USAID, and the World Food Program, to be able to put where we can in countries where we are working, especially here in Kenya, Ethiopia, where we are involved, programs that will contribute to reducing such human suffering in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the panel, the media, the guests, for being here today. My name is Lloyd LePage, and I'm the CEO of the CGIAR Consortium, based in Montpellier, France. This food crisis in the Horn of Africa is deeply troubling to all of us who have devoted our careers to agricultural research and development. We see the emergency interventions that are now underway, and they are, of course, vital and welcome. We must each do all that we can to help. But we all know that they do little to deal with the underlying problems that got us here in the first place. Yes, livestock management and farming conditions in the Horn are challenging. But let's be clear, they are not fated to produce famines. This current situation in Kenya and in the Horn of Africa should serve as a wake-up call to citizens, farmers, politicians, advocates, and scientists working in the region. We can prevent it from happening again if we are willing to embrace the research and policies that give farmers in the region the tools that they need to be resilient and in the face of increasing uncertainty. In East Africa, the CGIAR has over 2,000 staff working across a range of disciplines and several centers, including 2 based here in Nairobi, the International Livestock Research Institute, where we are today, and the World Agroforestry Center. These scientists work closely with national research institutes like ILRI to develop innovations and techniques that are working to address the complex challenges that face us today, as well as those that we will likely face tomorrow. That's not to say that we have all the answers. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to meet with the farmers and pastoralists in drought-prone areas in southeastern Kenya. Listening to them helped to further reinforce the idea that farmers and other stakeholders must be involved in research. For them to take ownership and to achieve durable results, we cannot just develop solutions and hand them down. They must be co-developed. Indeed, we must guard against the tendency to be seduced by the simple solution. For example, high-yield, drought-tolerant crop varieties and irrigation schemes get a lot of attention during droughts. They are important, but they are not the answer for all the areas, including large parts of Somalia, where livestock serves as the mainstay for food security. Let's be realistic. The current drought is a warning shot, an early indication of the immense challenges that we face in the future, not only here, but around the world. Climate change, economic instability, persistently high food prices, and rapid population growth are all coming on at the same time. We must move quickly, and we must move decisively. The food crisis in the Horn reinforces the need for research programs and partnerships that can generate long-lasting improvements. Farmers need a diversity of approaches for achieving food security. Increasing productivity is critical. Farmers in Kenya and elsewhere in this region who are planting our drought-tolerant maize varieties have dramatically increased yields even in conditions of very low rainfall. We need to provide solutions that respond to stressful growing conditions caused by climate change. In certain parts of Africa, achieving food security in hotter and drier weather may also require shifting from maize to more hardy crops like sorghum, cowpeas, and millet. And to achieve this, we are partnering with organizations like AGRA to support small seed enterprises, such as the Dryland Seed Company that I visited yesterday, that improve farmers' access to these drought-tolerant crops by selling them in inexpensive and small packets. But productivity increases alone are insufficient. There's no point in increasing productivity if it only leaves degraded lands or water scarcity for future generations. Short-term gains that yield long-term losses are not sustainable solutions. livestock provides more food security than growing crops in many arid and semi-arid areas. As many of the people in this room clearly understand, the food crisis in the Horn is essentially a livestock crisis. Community leaders here in Kenya further confirm that what our research shows, that the best way to prevent famine in arid lands is to ensure access to critical dry season grazing and watering areas for their livestock. In addition, they need information about drought and weather events ahead of time so that they can plan, knowledge of where the grazing is, education on appropriate responses, and in terms of animal health and best land use practice, and also market information and access to markets for emergency destocking. It's also important to recognize the close connection between pastoral livestock systems and wildlife. Both these systems are under intense pressure. Today, we need more research on the synergies and trade-offs between conservation goals and farm livelihoods so that they can coexist tomorrow. The drought-induced crisis also shows the need for tools to manage risk. ILRI is working in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia to use weather models to predict the impact of drought on grazing land. With this information, we are providing low-cost drought insurance to poor herders in remote areas. Over 2,500 pastoralists already have purchased insurance through this program. Modest investments in agricultural research that allow the world's most vulnerable people to take charge of their food security are far less expensive than constantly parachuting in with food aid and humanitarian assistance, as important as that may be. Yet donors and governments continue to fall short of their promise to boost investments in the farm sector. In 2 weeks' time, members of the G20 will meet in France to outline priorities for global food security. We must renew commitments to international agricultural research and align global efforts to find preventative solutions to a crisis like this one. Working to achieve long-term and sustainable food security offers a clear and cost-effective path to stability on a global scale. After all, while today a drought has induced a crisis in the Horn of Africa, where might drought and famine strike tomorrow? And will we be prepared? Agricultural research can answer that question and help us to act now to prevent another unsettling and unnecessary food crisis in the region. The world of tomorrow needs answers that last. That's why we need to build them today, and we need to build them with our partners. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll take some questions. Please say your name and your organization, and we can start now. Anyone? David? Oh. Okay. No questions? You guys handled it all. Oh, Katie.
Mr. Lepage was talking about how it's really a livestock crisis, and yet a lot of the solutions you're still talking about research has been to do with agriculture and crops and changing diets and things, but I'm still not quite getting how you help pastoralists if there's droughts. Isn't the problem really the solutions are quite simple, but it's a lack of the will and investment from the government? I've spoken to one of your researchers at ILRI a while ago about this livestock insurance thing, and you're saying, this is really quite a small thing. If we did something like this tarmac road, that would make more difference than all of this stuff. So we really need all this science and investigation, or isn't it just getting the government to put money into these areas, and particularly into livestock?
Great question. Go ahead. The question, I'm sorry, was whether or not, I mean, a lot of the focus of the response from the panelists were on technological solutions and whether or not it's really about political will and the government's investing. There was a researcher from ILRI, I believe, who said that if we built a road, in Marsabit there's a livestock insurance program, and that this is very affecting a small amount of people, but if we built a road, that would have a much bigger impact on development in the region.
Thanks. I'll perhaps start off with a question, maybe pass it down, because I think that it is a policy question, and perhaps our donor partners, the development partners, as well as the Kenya government can answer that question. In terms of the people that we've met, certainly in terms of the pastoral systems, there is definitely a call for information. They need information ahead of time. They need information to be able to move their herds to the right grazing areas. They need to be able to say, where are those grazing areas? Where does it exist? Is there really a drought coming ahead of time? We have all of the weather information systems available at our fingertips right here, in our offices. But how does that information get out to the farmer? And how does that information get out in time so that they can make those decisions to either destock or to move their cattle to another area, or even to be able to access the markets at the right time? But of course, there is some policy dimension to that. So.
Maybe I could add to some of the issues that have been raised. It's true, one of the major problems and one of the major things that we are looking at and also advising on. Every time that an irrigation system is put in place, what tends to happen is we tend to replace grazing with crops, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a major concern, because you are right in the middle of an area where livestock is the major livelihood. And now you are taking over the better land, the dry season grazing areas, developing an irrigation system there and replacing pasture. That's something we are trying to address. I talked about a small irrigation scheme that we've started on the edge of Changi Desert. One of the major crops coming out of that is grass. So that you're not replacing the livelihoods. And we have seen pastoralists travel very long distances to come into that irrigation scheme and buy grass and not buy maize or buy some other crops. So that's an issue. And as we develop some of this infrastructure, we should be looking at how do they relate to the livelihoods in the zone where we have them. So that's a major concern. Infrastructure is very, very important. I totally agree. And about 3 years ago, 4 years ago maybe, we were discussing the issue of the road from Nairobi to Marsabit. And at that point in time, everybody said it doesn't make sense to do that road. And we went in with a very small activity and just looked at how much the pastoralists lose as they transport their cattle on that very bad road into Nairobi. And basically right now, the government is on the ground. They've done the Cielo Merida Road, part of the road. We've seen activities between Merida and Marsabit. And now I'm told a contractor is on the ground doing Marsabit to research is influencing what policy is looking at. So I agree with you, we need to influence a bit of that so that as they make decisions about where to put infrastructure, then they have basis on which then they can put on those investments.
Yeah, I think also the idea of infrastructure is also the realization that there are, is it on?
Yep.
Yeah. That at the community level, there are appropriate and known technologies that can be used that allow rainwater when it does happen to be captured and actually raise the water table. So I think it's not one or the other. I think there are community-based activities that can really strengthen resilience. And that investment coupled with the larger projects such as irrigation, such as market strengthening, such as infrastructure, can all help to further strengthen resilience of communities that are exposed to risks on an ongoing basis.
Just add one or two comments. I think that you do raise a fundamental point. I think that let's actually be really honest and clear. There is a conventional wisdom that the investments in the arid and semi-arid lands does not have as high a return, as investments from a development point of view as investments in other areas. And this is in part, driven by a conventional wisdom of low low population rates and a range of other issues that affect that. But as we begin to step back, and we look at the issue and say how important are the arid and semi-arid lands to development, I think that one of the important things that we get from research is evidence to help to have a better and more informed discussion about that issue. When we begin to look at the important goods and services that come from those systems, we begin to put into perspective that they are extremely important for the national level development that is allowing a more balanced investment plan to be put forward by countries in the development community. Science, knowledge, research is helping to bring balance to that, and I think that as we begin to see what is the opportunity there, there's no doubt that livestock systems are the main economic system of the arid lands, and a question is how to actually ensure that they are developed in a manner that can actually sustainably increase incomes and improve the livelihoods of those groups. And science and technology must actually be at the heart of coming up with some of those solutions. It is true that the livestock value chain will require itself development and infrastructure and improved services that are going to be extremely important, and that the solution in these areas is not simply the agricultural research, but it does require public services to be strengthened, that allows education and health systems to really be able to be developed. And taking a more comprehensive view of this, arid and semi-arid lands development is I think fundamentally what is on the table, needing attention. Is this viable? How important are they? And I think the dialogue that is taking place today, tomorrow, over the next several days, which is asking these fundamental questions about how important are these systems to national development, can play an important role to inform, sort of the national policy debates and discussions taking place across the region and across the globe, as this area is very much a focus of development discussion taking place today.
Thank you. Marcus?
Marcus Heftiger, correspondent for my Swiss-based newspaper. What role? I think I need that. What role could or should modern abattoirs play? Modern in the sense that the meat they produce could be sold in regional markets or even exported to Europe.
And also to add that, as you know, the Horn of Africa, especially Somalia, is a big exporter to the Arabian Peninsula in terms of livestock.
Fundamentally, I think that the future must actually be allowing the systems that are connecting these producers to both regional and global markets. The development of systems that allows better access to these is going to be critically important, and abattoirs that are going to actually create products, goods, and services that help these populations penetrate these systems will be critically important. Little doubt about that.
We also have someone from ILRI, Bruce.
Thank you. Good question. Certainly the work that ILRI has been involved with, along with CARI and other partners, has shown that one of the critical issues in terms of maintaining the livestock system is the whole issue of markets, and abattoirs are an essential part of that value chain, if you wish. And I think it's fair to say that those markets, in a more formal sense, throughout the region, have not worked for the benefit of people in arid areas as effectively as they should or could be working, and therefore adding a tremendous amount of added value and income to the national budgets as a result of that.
Marcus, we can probably get you someone that could speak on that from ILRI as well. But
Just to add that, the question of abattoirs raises the question that a lot of the discussions that we are having are being done in segments. But you should look at the whole value chain. To be able to have abattoirs, you do need to have the market. You do need to have the production. You have to have the feed. You have to have the productive base for feed production. So, which is just not segmented. You cannot separate, let me say, the livestock from crops or pasture. So it's really linked and requires a lot more holistic approach than normally is given. That is, we look at things in little segments, whereas it is a whole chain that is that's connected from the soil, from land management, and let me say water harvesting and the planting of multi-purpose trees that can also be used for forage, all the way to the consumer. So really, maybe we should take advantage of the situation that has been come up to look at the whole system, the value chain of what to be able to do for livestock in this arid and semi-arid areas.
This is for the entire high table. I don't want to sound alarmist, but when you talk about 12 million to 13 million, are we saying that they are faced with imminent death if nothing is done to save lives? Or these are the people who require assistance? That's number one. Mr. Gongi talked about NGO private engagements. When you go to meetings, because you are very critical, what is the feeling between the NGO and private sectors and the state representatives at those forums? I am alluding to the Kenyans for Kenya initiative. Was there goodwill from everyone, especially from the state? And on donor support, Gongi talked of African governments or leaders have to be arm-twisted to even make a commitment to set aside 10% budget to promote agriculture. How much have donors poured into the Horn of Africa during this catastrophe? Seeds exploited, this is for curry, 100 tons. Was it, I'm not feeling jealous, but was it really a nice thing to do, to export seeds when we desperately needed them for these for the drought affected area? Again, Chalbi is very far from Nairobi. Went from Marsabit on your way to ILRI, and then you have an oasis in that island of an irrigation project. Now you're only producing grass, so I heard. What about other crops? And is it a case of putting the cart before the horse? Because roads there, you drive at a speed of 30 to 40 kilometers an hour on way to Chalbi or to ILRI.
Let's get to the last question. Also, can you introduce yourself? Name and outlet.
Oh, I am Henry Wahinya. I'm a science feature writer for Media Max, but I do that for the People Daily newspaper. Media Max also has K24 and Kameme FM.
Thank you. So the first one was for Mark on the definition of what we mean.
Thank you. Good morning again. I think we need to be aware when the term 12 to 13 million people affected by the current crisis in the Horn of Africa needs to be sort of understood that this really is what we're talking about is households or individuals that have been affected by the combination of multiple drivers. And affected ranges from someone who's in the need of immediate humanitarian life-saving assistance, be it nutritional rehabilitation, be it food, and I'm not saying this is, including all the way to, for example, vaccination campaigns, because livestock, as we know, after a period of drought, when it rains, you have an upsurge in infections. So that number is really looking at all the population in the Horn of Africa that has been affected and the various types of responses, both humanitarian life-saving, but also, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, the resilience building to ensure that assets are not lost, be it livestock, be it seeds, be it tools, or replenishment if they have been, to ensure that households that have been affected by, as I indicated, 2 poor seasons or 2 well below normal seasons of rain, how they can be able to quickly start to return to a bit more normalcy with some type of assistance.
Thanks. The second question is for Dr. Ngongi on the goodwill, I think, between NGOs and the private sector.
Well, that's a good question. But I would say that I was old enough to see the independence struggle in Africa. So you realize that most of our states emerged from fighting against colonialism and seeing the private sector, as was established, working hand in hand with the colonial authorities. So the private sector was looked upon like the enemy. Okay? Now, more and more, the private sector is in the hands of Africans. It's African operators who are now in the private sector, by and large. So it is no longer that situation of a perceived conflict between the private sector and the state or the people. So really, even the NGO community, which is really to defend the rights of people, of the population, is more and more open to collaborative work with the private sector. So I think the ideological arguments that were there before are no longer really there, and no longer valid. And there are many examples. I think I gave an example here of using public money to leverage funding from private sectors, isn't it? So that is more and more a collaborative effort between governments, which is now more and more called public-private partnerships, which are being established all across all the development sphere, including in agriculture. So I think I hope that will continue. As for the 10%, it was not the governments were arm twisted. It is they who took an engagement in the Maputo conference, the second African Union Heads of State Summit in Maputo, that they undertook to devote 10% of their national budget to agriculture. That was in 2003. We are now in 2011, 8 years after. I think there are about 7 or 8 countries that have crossed the 10,000 line, 10% line, and then most of the other countries have made some progress. The overall average has now increased to about 5% of national budgets, which was less than 4%, probably 3% before 2003. There has been progress, but not fast enough.
Lloyd?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point about the discussion on civil society organizations and private sector. You know, I think there's an increasing realization across all sectors that we cannot do this alone. We cannot solve these complex problems by working in isolation. We have to be able to work across sectors, across large companies, small companies, medium companies, across multinational, across local, across public sector organizations, civil society organizations. We need to combine our efforts. And most importantly, we need to involve farmers in that discussion. As I've talked about earlier, I think farmers very often are the ones that are left out of the discussion. And yet they are the ones who need to benefit from the solution. So they need to be part of that, understanding the research, be involved in the research, and really need to be part of that discussion as well. And we just cannot, we need to get beyond our sector mentality and really work together to solve these problems.
Thank you, Bwana Wahinya. Let me start by adding on to what my colleagues have said about the interaction between private sector, government agencies, and all that. As I said during my address, even in government sector, even in public sector like CGIAR, we are starting to realize our research results do not go anywhere until you start working with the private sector. A very good example that I had talked about is the sorghum for malting. We had very little funds to do that. But just 2 weeks ago, EABL has actually now invested 2.6 million US dollars to develop that system. That's already an indication that private sector, public sector activities are starting to work. We had to invest a little public money to convince them that it's a workable thing, and now they're already investing in a very big way. So I think it's something that is developing. It's something that we need to carry on with, and I believe it's the way to go. Let me come back to some of the direct questions that you asked. Kalacha irrigation scheme and what we are doing there. It's not an isolated case, because I think that's your worry. Now, all we are doing in Kalacha is demonstrating a model that then should be upscaled into all the other regions and the other areas where similar conditions exist. And one of the other things we've done with that is went the whole of northern Kenya and characterized all the areas where similar activities can be done. We looked at the soils, we looked at the water, we looked at the production systems that exist, and we have information where if an NGO needs to develop a small irrigation scheme, we can give them the information that they need to do the right thing in the new area that they are going on. So Kalacha is not an isolated case itself, it's just a model to show what can be done by adding knowledge, information, and developing structure, development infrastructure. So that's a major thing. One of the major things that made us grow grass is very simple. It's actually food and nutrition security. If you go into Kalacha, what happens is that when the livestock move in search of pasture, the settled community, which is basically mainly women and children, are left behind with what we call the home herd. Now, you've been left with a home herd in an area where pasture has been exhausted completely. And your main source of livelihood has moved. Maybe it's all the way in Ethiopia. And you are in Kalacha. Where does your food then come from? One of the major things we are doing with this grass is feed that home herd that is left then to feed the women and the children. So that's the reason where we are thinking the grass is maybe a better option than taking in a crop maize into that area. We're also looking at not only the grass, but what other feed resources could we develop in that area to make that herd even better. And we are looking at working with ICADA on tolerant barley for feeding the livestock and things like that. So it's not really an isolated case. You talked about the issue of export of seeds. Now, I want to come to this from a regional perspective. If you look at the conditions that we have in northern Kenya are very similar to the same conditions we have in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So the research results that we generate are of interest to our neighbors also. And therefore, when we developed this grass seed production system, a lot of NGOs, FAO included, were willing to test that in our neighboring countries. And that's how we came to provide this seed, so that then the technology is not only covering Kenya, but it's covering the region. It's helping the region in terms of productivity.
We have a few more questions. One, given the global shortage of, this comes from Twitter, global shortage of soil scientists, to what extent are these kinds of programs considering local soil variations in the Horn? And also, how do you know the yield issue can be solved by new seed rather than better soil management? From the panel.
Can I take on that? I think as my colleague from Agra said, one of the problems we are facing is working in small compartments. Throw in the seed and everything works. It doesn't. You have to bring natural resource management, seed, better handling facilities for you to get a crop. It's not really a one-off thing. And unfortunately, for a long time, that's how we've been operating. CGIAR has this new wonder seed. But when you put it in the wrong agronomic systems, maybe you are even worse than your older seed. So it's a whole system. We need to work to look at not only the seed, but the management system, the way we use the water, the way we use the soil to get a production going.
That's a very critical question for generally Africa. In that, in Africa we are really short of agricultural scientists, not only for soil scientists, but crop scientists also, general agronomists included. In AGRA, we are trying to bridge the gap by having a training program for soil sciences, which is about 150 of them, 100 of them at master's degree level and 50 at the doctorate level. That's not enough. In fact, we have a program here in Kenya with the Kenyatta Agricultural University, which is working fine, but we do need to multiply these numbers because there's a big gap between the people who were trained in the 60s and 70s and those who are being trained now. There were virtually no training, very little training between the 80s and the 2000. So we have to redouble efforts to fill that gap. But the soil management is very critical because really here in just a trip we made in Western Kenya, physical observations of liming and trying to upscale the use of lime. I think we have all been, those who have been reading the press now in Nairobi, have been seeing what impact just liming has brought into increasing yields without necessarily increasing fertilizer use or changing the varieties. Because of soil acidity, that's preventing roots of crops to get deeper into the soil and exploit water and natural fertility of the soil. So, and Africa's soils are so diverse that we do need to have a lot more research on all different agroecologies to be able to give advanced solutions or propose solutions to farmers that are really workable and sustainable.
The next question.
Jeff, can I just add to that? So, I think, this is a key role. It's not just about the very good point about making sure that we have enough soil scientists to be able to do this. We also need to start using advanced methodologies for testing. For example, our center here in Nairobi, the ICRAF, or World Agroforestry Center, has developed rapid, assessment, soil assessment tools that can generate results in a much quicker manner than was done 10 years ago, where it might have taken 3-4 weeks per sample. They can now run that through in a matter of hours. That also brings down the costs. They're involved with the African Soil Mapping Initiative, so that we can get not only the details in a very broad manner, but we can get specific details at the field level and notice those differences between even parts of the field. So we need those new innovations, new technologies to apply also for analysis as well in terms of soils.
Naftali?
Yes, my name is Naftali Muigai. I'm a Kenyan journalist but writing for some continental news agency. I want to ask the panel members this hot question. As we sit down here, the 1st of September 2011, are we likely to look out and mobilize the governments, donors, private sector, and have a Marshall Plan to end hunger in Africa once and for all? And if at all we had that Marshall Plan, what would it include in terms of the money, the infrastructure, the expertise, stuff like that? The other question, and I believe Dr. Namaga Gogi, you're going to answer me because I've questioned you on that before. We were bypassed by the agrarian revolution as it happened in Asia in the 1960s. Because the vision of the political leaders then, of course they were benevolent dictators, was very forthright. They had to feed their people at all cost. They didn't care about the so-called democracy, whatever, liberal rights and stuff like that. Here in Africa, in our context now, can we get our leaders do whatever it takes to have a green revolution, using the resources that are available? We have water resources, but they're declining because of mismanagement and, especially mismanagement and climate change. But we have the agricultural research confined in ivory towers. It's not translating on the ground. That's where my problem is. The third question is about innovation.
Let's keep it to two for now, because we only have a few, and then we can do it all.
Okay.
So the first one is Marshall Plan for African Agriculture. What would it take, how much money, and what would be the priorities? And the second, I think, is how do we sort of get research down from the ivory tower to make an impact and lead to transformation? Any?
I can start, but well, AGRA is an alliance for a green revolution in Africa. So the Marshall Plan should be a green revolution for Africa, because that is what is needed to be able to bring about that change. Unfortunately, the word Green Revolution might mean just a photocopy of the Asian Green Revolution. It is not. It means bringing about a unification of national policy, technologies that have been developed, researched for ongoing, and investment that is needed to be able to mobilize the energies and skills of farmers to make the change, not just productivity, but in a sustainable productivity that will lead to a rapid transformation of agriculture in Africa. We cannot continue to be the continent that is having a declining per capita production of food year after year. We cannot continue to be that continent. We cannot continue to be producing 1 metric ton of grain equivalent per hectare. That is ridiculous. When other parts of the world are reaching an average of 5 metric tons, in the United States about 7 to 10 metric tons per hectare. In China, with 2 crops they can get 12 or 14 metric tons. Here in Africa, in Egypt, 2 crops per year, they can get probably 10 to 14 metric tons of rice per hectare. Why would the rest of the continent be stuck at 1 metric ton per hectare? Which means there are known methods, known technologies, known things that can be used to go beyond 1 metric ton. At least let us hit 3, and hopefully in the future 5 metric tons per hectare. And Africa will not only be feeding itself, it will actually be contributing to global food security. But that requires heavy investment. Not all. So if all the African countries reach the 10%, they will probably reduce the need for external assistance from the total budget today calculated by IFPRI was about $39 billion a year in investments. If they all reach their 10% target, their own resources probably will amount to $20 or $22 billion, which means the gap would be $19 to $17 billion, which could probably be met by external assistance. But we also have the private sector from which resources can be mobilized, which means that really the external resources from Africa will be much less than maybe 10 or 7 billion. It can be done if we only put the will to do it, and not only signing agreements, but actually putting the budgetary allocations that should back those agreements. So I believe that we have the environment today is quite ready. The technologies are known, and the farmers are ready. So if we had the will to upscale that what's known already, we'll be able to reach that green revolution, an African green revolution based on a variety of staple food crops adapted to Africa, not only to the 2 crops of wheat and rice that made the green revolution in Asia, although they have many other crops, but those were the 2 principal crops that they used. Thank you.
Okay. Please. One more. Last question.
I'm Niles from the Truth Weekly newspaper. Apart from Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, which is seriously affected by the drought, which other countries are there in Africa are seriously affected by the drought? Or what are they doing to ensure that they have enough during these drought seasons?
So I think it's overall sort of how to reduce vulnerability to drought in other African countries, and where are those places that they're at-risk areas.
Well, to come back to your question, I think it summarizes what is currently being done to protect populations that are potentially at risk. And I think one of the key things is safety nets. Looking at government programs that provide a guarantee to communities that if we know, using our information that we have on hand, our vulnerability analysis, being able to identify at a particular point in time that it's likely to move into another drought, are there programs that can then be used, be it through schools, or be it through some sort of cash program that ensures that households, when they are affected, are provided with some modicum to ensure that they don't need to then strip their assets and start to move into greater and greater difficulty. This would then allow affected households to remain and then also be able to reinvest once the drought ends, because droughts do end. They don't remain forever. And it's making sure that populations are ready to be able to start again after the drought.
Ivory towers and scientists.
It's been with
No, just to add to that point, I think it's important also that we first of all combine forces and say, okay, where are the areas that are really vulnerable to these kinds of conditions? What are the hotspots? A lot of the work that we've done in the CGIAR relates to hotspots. But how do we combine that with the information from the FAO and from the World Food Program and from the national science programs and others, and how do we identify those areas where we can plan ahead of time? And it's important, not just to look in the rearview mirror and say what happened in the past. Climate change is a fact. It is happening. So how are we going to respond to the changes that are, what research do we need to do to say what impact the climate change will have on vulnerable areas? How will that change from time to time as we go into the future? And how are we prepared for that? What do we need to do? Not just about more tolerant crops or more tolerant livestock, but also how will the disease patterns change? How will the insect patterns change that are around that? And how are we prepared to respond? We've already seen diseases that are occurring in Africa moving northwards. So it's not just about Africa. It's about a global food security issue, and we need to be able to respond to that now. So the research we're doing in Africa today is also beneficial to the rest of the world.
Jeff and then Namanga.
Yeah, I'd like to just actually reflect on your question a little bit larger than you are posing it with regard to drought, right? What are the countries are actually facing, the kind of vulnerabilities that these countries are. The reality is that today in most countries, and you're going to be hard-pressed to find a country in Africa that doesn't have between 35 and 60% of its population that are near or below the poverty line. This places a very large share of the population at risk to different types of risks, and they will, be confronted with whether it is drought or an economic shock or, instability or various types of issues. And so that, the question of vulnerability is a significant question for Africa. And there are different strategies that are needed to address, the different kinds of challenges that exist that are there. Agriculture is at the heart of, the economic systems in Africa and must be a real part of the solution of reducing vulnerability. And that means that different solutions, tailored, to those different regions need to be developed. And so I think that that's actually a critical, part of the question. And you're really asking, it's reflecting very much on the earlier question, is there a real commitment to take on this issue of vulnerability? I believe that one of the most innovative things that have happened in my lifetime is that actually African leaders together created a vision and said, we're tired of this vulnerability. We, as Africans, are tired of this vulnerability and created a vision to say, we want to actually tackle this challenge. This is our problem. We need to own it, and we need to actually come to terms with it. You've seen the commitment towards, the CAADP, which has led countries to actually come to terms with investment plans aimed at tackling their vulnerabilities, and that has happened, today in 24 countries. We're seeing that there is a follow-through on those statements, but we need the countries to deliver on the commitments that they've made, right? And that does provide a framework for coordination and assistance from the development community. This is a top priority among the development community. It is consistently on the agenda with the leaders, the global leaders around the world to tackle, these issues, and that is evident in it being a prominent issue among the G20, and it has been and will be in the forthcoming meeting that is coming along. So there is an opportunity, as Dr. Ngongi had actually suggested, and others have suggested. There is a time now, and it is urgent, and it is actually a good opportunity to say, how do we rally the forces to come to terms with these issues? And so that I think that if we could answer the question, will we solve this problem? There would be some. It would be difficult to answer that question. Is the momentum moving along many different lines to actually tackle this issue? Yes.
I just wanted to add that to your question, that in the 70s and early 80s, the region that was having such problems was the Sahel. It's a long time since we heard anything about the Sahel facing real food shortages. does not mean that they don't have partial droughts or droughts in some countries. They do. But they created an interstate commission for the fight against drought, which was built mostly around information sharing, that all the states share information, therefore you know where stocks are, and a stocking system and a trade system that permitted food to move from, let me say, Burkina Faso all the way to Mauritania, or from Mali to Senegal. And so the system functions, and it has been there for more than 30 years now as this interstate commission. So clearly, if the region is a regional issue, if the countries in a region were able to share information on what stocks are available, how food can move freely from one country to the other, and have trading systems which have removed the barriers, I think we'll be able to reduce the gravity of such situations in the future. You are all aware of the periodic export bans that go on in the region. I mean, so if those are taking place, it does not help really in moving food that is available close by, whereas you'll be relying on importing food from 10,000 kilometers away when food is available probably less than 500 kilometers away.
Thank you very much for joining us today. If you need any follow-up interviews after this or to speak with anyone, just let us know. Thanks.